Well, hello there, and welcome to another edition of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell, and we are continuing today down the lane of extremely rare Japanese aircraft. We're going to talk about the Aichi, the D3A Type 99, the VAL, the dive bomber. And today, Greg is keeping me in, we're kind of headed into October. Maybe I'm a scarecrow. This might be apropos because this airplane scared the heck out of a lot of the opposing allied navies. We're going to talk about that. And I'm going to go ahead and pull off my this was an interesting hat. This was kind of itchy today, Greg. This was itchy. My Radamantine assistant, toss it off camera there, and he got it. A good catch by the Kenny. So today we're talking about the VAL dive bomber. Now, the interesting thing about the VAL, I'll go ahead and give you a plan view of the airplane. We've spent time on dive bombers as a technology that was really supplanted by cruise missiles and directed munitions, and that is what was the end of the dive bomber. But in their time, the dive bomber was probably the most dangerous weapon against capital ships at the beginning of World War II. Now, the way you dealt with them, and we've talked about that, is if you had a good cap, a good combat air patrol, and they were at the right height, dive bombers were particularly vulnerable. But once they started into that dive, they were deadly accurate, and they were almost unstoppable once they went into attack mode. But they went away with guided missiles and stuff like that. But at that time, they were very dangerous. Now, this aircraft first flew in 1938. It was introduced in 1940. There were 1,495 of these built. It has a low-mounted elliptical wing that is also used on the Henkel, the Aichi 70 Blitz. Greg, I'm going to have you looking up some stuff here today. The Blitz used a similar wing. Now, in some quarters, people will argue, and you can argue with me in the comments section, that the VAL was based on an Ernst Henkel design, and that Henkel was heavily involved in the design of this dive bomber. It did have wheel pants similar to the Stuka. It was used in a different way. The Stuka was used as a breakthrough weapon in the Blitzkrieg. This was used as a maritime denial aircraft. It went after Allied capital ships. This particular type of aircraft sank more Allied warships than any other Axis aircraft, if you can believe that, in World War II. So, as I said, it was deadly dangerous when it was employed the right way. In the dive, the pilot could withstand about anywhere from 6 to 9 Gs. You had to be, Greg, absolutely certifiable, in my opinion, to go down and be pulling those kind of Gs and hope we would pull out. But it was a high G aircraft. It was a replacement for the D3A, and it evolved into and I'm going to butcher this, the Yokosuka, the D3Y. Now, what was the interesting thing about the D3Y? It was made entirely of wood. There were 2 prototypes made and 3 production aircraft. It was very heavy. It never worked out, and the Japanese had lost the initiative at that point, so the airplane never made it into production, but it was made entirely of wood because the Japanese were running short on raw materials, and so they needed to come up with something. It carried a 550-pound bomb, similar on a center line with a kind of throw carriage to throw the bomb away from the prop, as we've seen with other aircraft, at a maximum speed of 270 miles an hour. Now, the interesting thing about this was the prototypes were really squirrely. The Japanese prototypes were very squirrely in flight test, and the airplane had a tendency to snap roll. They changed the control surfaces a little bit and were able to correct that in the production versions. The comparable airplanes, and here I'm going to have some fun with you, Greg. Comparable aircraft at the time were the Dauntless, of course, the Helldiver, the Farley Barracuda, the Vultee Vengeance, the Italian, the Beata BA.65 or -65. See if you can find that one. The Italians, by the way, the Italians in the Mediterranean, and of course I'm of Italian descent, actually had a really good fleet in the Mediterranean. So, Greg, the Italians did actually have some maritime influence there, and Greg is smirking at me there. And then, of course, Greg, the other comparable aircraft is the Lithuanian, the Anbone 8. Of course, the Lithuanians, they were known for their dive bombing prowess, but that was the comparable breed of aircraft. Aichi, Nakajima, and Mitsubishi all submitted designs for a dive bomber in this type, but they prevailed. Aichi prevailed and really developed a fearsome weapon. Now, production, as I said, was at 1495, and historically, Greg, let's talk about that. If you look at, by the way, I am wearing the chief protagonist of the Japanese aircraft in the Grumman aircraft at the time, which were the bane of these airplanes' existence later in the war. 1,495 built, 1,500 airplanes. Now think about that. I'm standing in front of our ship exhibit, which, by the way, in the Pacific hangar, if you get a chance, you've got to see this. This is an incredible ship exhibit. There's probably about 50 ships in here of all different types, many of which were victims of this aircraft, I might add, in the conflict. But if you get a chance, don't miss this exhibit in the Pacific hangar. But the Japanese, we talked about the psyche of Japanese defense and of Japanese offensive weapons and how they led up to World War II. They had embraced the carrier because they realized that they were going to have to defend large expanses of ocean. And so, but think about what they did. They had their fleet carriers, which evolved out of the battleship. Again, they correctly surmised to be able to project over the horizon power was important, and to be able to fly airstrikes against these island bastions that they were attacking made sense. But they built essentially enough aircraft for their air wings at the time. And so the air wings that attacked Pearl Harbor with Yamamoto as the chief strategist, they had enough aircraft to carry out offensive operations. What ended up happening at the Battle of Midway, two things. At the Battle of Midway, they lost 4 fleet carriers and all of those air crews and aircraft. So with that went a large amount of their capability in order to be on the offensive into the Pacific. And we've talked about Midway, high watermark for the advance of the Japanese, but even more so, it is endemic of the Japanese really thinking, and Yamamoto realized this, that if he only had enough offensive weapons to carry out a really devastating strike against the Americans. If the Japanese suffered combat losses, they simply did not have the production capacity to be able to keep up with the United States once it came into the war in like 1943. He understood that. And so he realized that you go to war with what you have. And at the time, we were not prepared for that. But once they started suffering combat losses and they lost those 4 fleet carriers at Midway, the epitaph was written. The writing was on the wall. They were never, ever going to be able to prevail. And the plan of really bloodying up the Allies, both the British, the United States, and getting the British and the United States to accept the Japanese prosperity sphere in the Pacific, if they could not get the Americans to sue for peace. And Pearl Harbor was totally the wrong way to go about it because it infuriated the Americans to the point where the Americans would settle for nothing but total victory. The Japanese, once they suffered that defeat, could never come back from that. And so you look at these small production numbers, and we're talking about another aircraft next week, which is again, very rare, that very, very low production. And the other side of that was on the manufacturing side. We talked about the Zero last week. The Zero's production in the wing box and the wing production on a lot of these airplanes, as opposed to the American mass-produced counterparts, were very slow. It took the Japanese a long time to build these airplanes. They were not suited for mass production. So once they were gone, the Japanese were not going to be able to fill the void. So this aircraft continued to soldier on in very limited numbers. They were last employed in any great strength at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the Japanese were hoping to be able to bushwhack the Americans with their superior. They had a number of battleships, a number of capital ships left. They did not have enough aircraft and air wings to make any difference in the battle at all. And the carriers, Japanese carriers, were actually used as bait, but they to try to lure away the American fleet. But they were used in numbers there. After that, they were expended primarily in kamikaze attacks towards the end of the war, and the airplane went on into history. It does not survive in any great numbers. I actually worked on a project with the Nimitz Museum, and they have a tail section of a Val, but that's about as close as I ever got to a complete airplane. They just don't exist. There were aircraft that were created for Tora, but you will never, ever see one of these flying again. As I said, most of the aircraft, or all the aircraft that are in the Pacific now that are left, are hulks, and you'd have to completely rebuild one of these from a data plate. That's just not going to happen. So what is the lesson of this aircraft? The lesson of this aircraft is that these directed munitions, especially in the Pacific, were the perfect weapon. This was the perfect weapon in 1940 at the perfect time to be able to clear the seas of their maritime opponents and carry the day. But like everything else that happened in the Pacific, eventually the Japanese were just completely overwhelmed by American production and numbers. And as I said, by mid or I would say the beginning in 1943, and you can argue with me in the comments section, that the Japanese loss, they were going to lose. It was just a question of what the time that they were going to lose. So I'm going to put this down, and I'm going to do my salute today. Now, Greg has really outdone himself. You know, the last one last week, Greg, was actually pleasant, and it had a little marble in it. This is not pleasant. This is worm ooze. Thank you. Worm ooze, which I've never heard of. Always ask for Avery. Let's see. It's soda disgusting. Totally gross soda. Oh, I'm really looking forward to this one. There is no calorie count on it. It doesn't look like it has any carbonation. So this one may have been on the shelf for a while. This may be a botulism candidate. The salute that I want to give today is to, oh, I can smell that. I just opened it. Oh, that smells absolutely disgusting, Greg. It's living up to its name. Salute I want to do today is at the Battle of Midway. We not only had the Dauntless and the dive bomber pilots, but we had those, and we're going to talk next week about torpedo bombers, those torpedo bomber crews that were devastated. And torpedo bombers, the Devastator and the Dauntless, by the end of 1942, early 1943, were essentially obsolete airplanes. They were still operating, but they were obsolete. The Devastator, so much so. But one of the things that you cannot overlook is the torpedo crews, the torpedo bomber crews, and the dive bomber crews' tenacity. They were so tenacious. And at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese would not have lost and been defeated had it not been for the torpedo bomber crews, those Devastator crews, pulling the combat air patrol down, and the lucky happenstance of the dive bomber crews finding the Japanese carriers at the right moment. And so I want to salute. We talk a lot about the fighter crews and the combat air patrols, but if it weren't for those attack pilots, either the dive bomber crews or those torpedo bomber crews, the United States Navy would not have been victorious. So to those guys and those attack crews, I salute you. And I pray for my safety as I take a drink of this. Yeah, there's no carbonation there. This one is done. And I'm going to take another swig, Greg, but this could definitely be a botulism candidate. Ooh, that is completely flat. Greg, you know, we had a deal's a deal, and if I die from this, you know, so be it. But that was disgusting. Worm ooze did not make the list. Let's just say it was flat. Okay, so as we move on, now, if you want to go ahead and you could actually, Greg can play in the bathtub with the dive bomber attacking his ship, you can click on the link and order this die-cast battleship, very cool, for a loved one. And everyone knows that you should have a battleship. So click on the link and Jason will send you out one of these. It has a lot of really cool detail on it. I think it's very cool, great, suitable for a gift. Christmas is starting to come up, so you may want to do that. I don't know which battleship this is. It has a designation of 88 on the bow. I'm not sure that there was an 88, but I'm not a battleship aficionado, so I don't know whether that is true or not. But click on that link and get out there with Jason, and Jason will send you one of these very cool die-cast battleships. Now, the other thing, we cannot do all of these displays and all of this cool stuff without your donation. So if you see the donation link on this, click on the link, give us a few shekels, a few dollars in the donation link. We can certainly use it. We will put it to good use, and we appreciate that. If you've come across the channel and you like Warbird Wednesday and you're on YouTube, give us a subscription. We really appreciate it. We love watching those subscription numbers go up. Like us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, share us with a friend. Share Warbird Wednesday with a friend. They may want to learn about worm ooze. You never know. And I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Have a great day.